His research has mostly focused on formation and evolution of education and labor market inequalities over the life course. And more recently, he has focused in some areas like causal effect of schooling on learning inequality, which is, I believe, the topic of today's talk, and the disparities in labor market attainment of educational inequalities. And he has published part of this research in quite prestigious academic journals, not only at European level, but also at the world level, like the American Sociological Review, Socioeconomic Review, European Sociological Review, Social Forces. I think we are really privileged to have him here. I'm sure that he's going to be a good contribution for the DemoSoc Research Group and the department. So welcome, Giampiero, and the floor is yours. Giampiero, he will be talking approximately till 1 o'clock or slightly less. And then there will be an opportunity for comments and questions. So thank you.
Okay, can you hear me well? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Luis, for your kind words. I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you all for being here. Where do I start? I would like to start by dissecting a bit the title of my presentation, Learning in School or Because of School, and How Schools Affect Learning Inequality. And I have to say that as a social scientist, my substantive interest is almost exclusively in this second question, how schools affect inequality, learning inequality among kids that experience different conditions in the home environment. But the point that I will try to make in the first 15 minutes now is that actually, if you want to answer this question, you cannot avoid also answering the first question. That is about whether children simply learn while they are exposed to school because of factors that have nothing to do with school itself, or whether they learn exactly because of the exposure to schooling. Seems trivial, but it's actually not, as I will point out in a minute. But one step back, why focusing on learning inequality in the first place? I mean, we know that educational achievements, children's skills and cognitive outcomes are important. The mastery of, for example, language, but also more scientific domains is crucial for educational success, but also for labor market success. And it's also very predictive of later life outcomes, for example, health and other, a variety of important things in life. And there is plenty of evidence that childhood is actually a crucial phase for cognitive development. And this idea pretty much aligns with the common sense knowledge that we might have that children are actually fast learners. They learn fast, then their cognitive development in a way flattens. And I think, at least I am, but some of us are already on the declining phase after age 20. Those on the back are probably on the saddle point. But relatedly, there is strong evidence that there is a huge amount of inequality in learning and learning outcomes already when children are very, very young, even before that they enter school. We can think of many conditions in the home environment that are related to this amount of inequality. I will focus only on 3 of them: the family socioeconomic status, family SES. There is plenty of evidence that kids from higher socioeconomic background, whose parents are better educated, have better jobs, better income, do better on cognitive tests and more generally on school outcomes. The second is the migration background of kids, because in many countries, there is also evidence that even comparing kids of the same socioeconomic status, natives outperform migrants on cognitive tests. This, of course, depends from country to country and from the migration group that you consider, but we could make this statement. And finally, there is also evidence that there are gaps by parental separation, meaning that kids that experience parental separation early in life, do worse on cognitive tests than kids that actually have always lived with parents that are together. And the overarching question of this talk and of my research agenda in these 2-3 years is, well, where do schools stand in this process, in the generation of inequality? are schools, institutions that actually contributes toward compensating for the disadvantage at home by reducing inequality, or are schools even increasing learning inequality among kids that experience different conditions at home? This is the overarching question. And when thinking about this question, I think it's immediately apparent one main difficulty that we might have, that all kids are enrolled to school. So how we can manipulate children's exposure to schooling to understand the consequences of schooling for inequality. So in the beginning, I thought, it might be very simple to look at the evolution of inequality over time, over schooling. Imagine over a school year. Imagine this is first grade, second grade in primary school. Then you can have an advantage group, a disadvantage group, for example, different SES groups or natives or migrants. And you might observe something like this, that inequality is increasing over the school year. And then the first, reaction to this is that, well, this is suggesting that schooling is increasing inequality, isn't it? But then what I realize is that, well, what is happening here over the school year is the result of both school and non-school factors, right? Think of on a normal school day of a kid age 9 or 8 in primary school, he goes to school, he spends 5 to 8 hours in school, and then after school, he went back home. So what is influencing his learning is, both the time spent in school, but also the time spent out of the school, when he's playing with his friends, talking with his parents, his peers outside of the school, his siblings, and so on and so forth. So actually what is happening here is the result of both, the influence of school and non-school factors. But how can we isolate, the role of school factors to understand the effect of schooling? This is the main challenge. Because imagine, okay, we could do an experiment, which is impossible to do for ethical reasons, for many reasons, actually, right? But imagine we were able to do this experiment, we could select a control group of kids at random, and we say, well, these kids, go to school for less time over this school year. In that situation, what we might observe is an hypothetical scenario, is that the inequality, in the control group is actually larger than the inequality in the treatment group is larger than the inequality in the control group. This might be the case, for example, because those losing the most from the absence of schooling are the disadvantaged kids. Maybe because their parents cannot compensate, with good learning environments at home. And this is pretty much the idea of COVID increasing learning inequality, if you think about it. But the point is that we cannot do this experiment. So it could be exactly the opposite. It could be that in the treatment group, inequality is actually lower than the inequality in the control group. And this could be the case, for example, if are the advantaged kids who lose the most from schooling, maybe because they start schooling already with higher skills, and they are the ones, who are able to benefit from instructional inputs in school. This is pretty much the Ekman idea of the technology of skill formation. So we're back to the original question. What we might observe is this: if we have a lot of data to track children's skills development, but we don't have the counterfactual scenario out of the school. Okay, and in this field of research, experiments are not really an option because they are highly unethical, right? How can you say, hey, half of the kids go to school for, 6 months instead of 9 months over a school year? It's just impossible to do. So researchers try to exploit some natural experiments, if you will, exploiting, for example, some school reforms that extended the length of compulsory schooling, for example. Some others exploited school interruptions, for example, during the summer break or during COVID. But this design has some issues. First of all, they are very peculiar in the sense that, if there is no school reform, that you cannot basically study school effects, right? And on the other hand, the designs exploiting school interruption have some issues of internal validity, causal validity, because imagine what happened during COVID. school closed, but in the meantime, the whole world changed as well. So you might observe increasing learning inequality, but is this due to school absence, or is this due to the fact that people were dying, you were confined home with your parents, your siblings, and maybe some of your friends were in hospital? It's hard to know. So when thinking about how can I address this, I came up with this idea that in the end ended up being called the differential exposure approach. And I just want to spend 5 minutes giving you the intuition behind the idea. So imagine you have different kids, in this case, 2 kids, Peter and Simon. They are very young. They enter primary school around age 7, okay, on the same day. So they sit in the same classroom in primary school, okay, school starting fixed. And by chance, they also have the same birthday, okay? So they are the same age when they enter school. So in this situation, imagine that we could test these kids at random in 2 different days. Peter is taking the test in January, say in math, a cognitive test, but Simon is tested not in January, but maybe in March, a couple of months or 3 months later. Okay? Same cognitive test. In that situation, what I would expect, if I have to bet, is that Simon is doing better than Peter. Okay? Why? For 2 reasons at least. Because first of all, Simon, received more school exposure by the day of testing. He was in school longer before taking the test. So probably it's better, right? But what you also see here is that Simon was also overall older by the day of testing, and likely at a later maturation point. So if we had this data, we could actually estimate at the population level of these kids an average rate of learning, the amount of learning occurring per unit of time, not the individual one, because we have 1 test per kid, but the average. But then we wouldn't know whether this learning rate is caused by schooling, exposure, or by aging itself, cognitive maturation over age, because the 2 things are perfectly collinear in the process of aging in school, if you will. While kids are in school, they receive the instruction in school, but they're also aging. They cannot receive instruction without aging. This is a feature of the reality that we live in, right? Yeah, and then what this approach does simply decomposes this learning rate in these 2 components, a component that is due to schooling exposure and a component that is due to the fact that children are aging. Okay, but how is this possible? It's possible because actually it is not the case that all kids enter school, when they have the same age. Not all kids in the same classroom share the same birthday. The rules of enrollment into primary school in many countries allows for and actually creates age variation among kids that enter school on the same calendar day. So imagine a situation like this one, a more real world situation, if you will, in which Peter and Simon, are not the same age when they enter school, because Simon is a bit younger. Then he's tested a bit later, as before. But in the particular situation in which the difference in birth dates equal the difference in testing days, actually, then you can compare 2 kids with the same age, exactly the same age, the overall length of these bars, but one of them received more school exposure by the day of testing. Simon received more school exposure. So in this scenario, I would expect Simon to do better than Peter. Because even though they have the same age, Simon was in school for a longer time in his life. Okay? And Simon was in school for a longer time. Why? Because he entered school at a younger age, when he was a bit younger. And this is the composite effect identified by the differential exposure approach. The effect of receiving more schooling by entering school at a younger age. Yeah. That, if the rules are strictly implemented, would be impossible. Then they should enter school on the same day. Then parents can play with it, of course. Yeah, sure. This depends from country to country, but we're going to discuss this a bit. Yeah, so the effect is receiving more schooling exposure by starting school younger. In this way, we can identify the schooling effect, but within the same approach, we can also identify the age effect by comparing kids of the same, basically they receive the same schooling exposure, but one of them is younger at the day of testing because he entered school at a younger age. Okay, and this would be the age component of the learning rate. So long story short, if we have random variation in birth dates for kids that enter school on the same day, a random variation in testing dates, you can actually decompose the overall learning rate in the aging and schooling components. Yes. What about? This is just on average. Imagine, family SES doesn't exist, or parent, sure. Not if birth dates and test dates are random. Imagine that test dates are random, then they are by definition uncorrelated with any children or family characteristics. Theoretically, and if birth dates are random as well, this is a requirement of the approach. We need random variation in birth dates and testing dates. If this variation is not random, we might have some issues, but this is about the application of the design. But this, it is crucial. Yes. This is not confounding. This is the composite effect of being older at testing, which in reality can only happen if you are older when you enter school. You cannot disentangle the two in reality. This is a feature of the world, Yeah, but I can repeat, the point is, the age effect and the schooling effect include the age at entry effect, right? But then imagine what happens of a kid that enter first grade when you are 5 and your peer, your mate is 6. Then you end up schooling with a 1-year difference. So this is a substantive difference. This will make a difference, for the educational transition and in the labor market. So this is not confounding. This is part of the fact that we are studying. The effect of the age at testing, which includes the fact that you enter school younger or older. This was the idea. In reality, you have these 3 components: age at test, age at entry, and school exposure, but they are mathematically, one of the sum of the other. So you can only disentangle the effect of 2 that will include also the third one. But this is what I'm most interested in, the schooling effect. And this happens to be a real world policy. You can think of extending schooling exposure by letting kids start school earlier in life. This is the policy implication, if you will. Yeah. Would have been the same? Sorry. What do you mean? I mean, I'm making an example of 2 kids. Yeah, because, but only because of the randomization of birth dates and testing dates. So, of course, there are different kids. But imagine you have a population of kids and you randomize a treatment. Then you have the control group and the treatment group. Then on average, you shouldn't have any correlation with the treatment, right? No, I think the main issue is that people at home cannot hear the. Yeah, we can discuss it. Yeah, but I hope at least that the intuition is there. Then once you have the schooling effect and the aging effect that sum up to the learning rate, it's all downhill to understand whether this schooling effect actually changes by some family characteristics. Whether it changes by family SES, whether it changes by parental separation or migration background. This would answer the question of whether schools actually increase or decrease inequality. You cannot answer that question by looking at how learning rate differ according to the family background, for example. You need to isolate the school component of the learning rate to do that. This is the intuition. But now I want to talk a bit the application of this approach. And I aim to present results from 4 studies that examine different family characteristics and the school effects on inequality by these characteristics, SES and migration background in Germany, parental separation in Denmark, and then again SES inequality in the United States. But please keep in mind that these studies are very heterogeneous. They were meant to be single country studies, so the results are not perfectly comparable. They were not even meant to be comparable. And there is much more to each of these studies than I will present today. I will just present some selected findings. And also keep in mind that the only published study is the first one in which I basically developed the approach. The others are just work in progress. And as I said, they are very heterogeneous. They use different data. In Germany, I use data from the National Educational Panel study, which collected cognitive tests on a representative sample of children in grade 1, so the first year of schooling. And the nice thing is that I have tests in language, but also in more scientific domains like math and science. Then in Denmark, completely different data because I have actually registry data on all kids in Denmark in the year 2010 to 2018. And the nice thing is that I have multiple grades. So I have children in grade 2, 4, 6, and 8. So I can study school exposure effect, at different points of the school career. But the downside is that I only can combine this data with nationwide tests in reading. So I don't have a more scientific cognitive domain in this case. And last, in the US, I have survey data which are representative of kids enrolled in kindergarten and grade 1. Okay, the kindergarten year, and then grade 1 of primary schooling. And I have cognitive tests in math and reading. And this test, measure children's ability, but what I did, I simply standardized the test. So I will focus on inequality in relative terms, important to mention. Then, as I said, I have 3 characteristics of social stratification, if you will. The family SES, which is something I analyze in Germany and the US, and this is measured with parental education in Germany and a composite index, including parental education, income, and occupation in the US. Then in Germany, I have migration backgrounds. And here is important to say that I focus only on second generations of migrants. So kids who are born in Germany, but whose parents are born outside of Germany. And these parents might be from other Western countries, so Western migrants. From the former Soviet Union, this is one of the biggest migration groups in Germany. And last, I distinguish other non-Westerners, which I have to say in my sample mostly includes Turkish kids with a Turkish heritage, which is, I think, the second biggest migration group in Germany. And finally, in Denmark, I have parental separation, simply measured as whether kids experience or not, parental union dissolution in the early life. Yeah, then, sorry, is there a way to? No, there isn't. Okay, variation in testing days, the important requirement that this is random. So where is this variation coming from? In Germany and Denmark is coming from the simple fact that actually, for organizational reason, the fieldwork couldn't take place on the same day. So it was not feasible to test all schools on the same day. So the fieldwork was basically extended from February to June in grade 1 in Germany, and in Denmark was extended in each grade from January to April. And this basically created, a variation from 3 months in Denmark up to 5 months of schooling exposure in Germany. And you might wonder whether this variation is random. And seems so, according to, by reading the fieldwork, the fieldwork report, at least, the decision was not made based on, school characteristics. So it's not the case that schools with low achievers or higher share of migrants, were tested earlier or later over the school year. And this is crucial because any correlation would actually cause selection bias in the estimation of schooling effects. And then in the US, the situation is a bit different because for each grade, kids were tested twice, in the fall and the spring. Okay, so what I did, I simply randomized myself kids in the 2 periods. So for each kid, I selected randomly either the fall or the spring test. So in this case, randomization is perfect. Then, like in a simulation, I repeated the process 1,000 times, and then I combined the estimates and also the standard errors using the Rubin's rule. But the nice thing here is that, this randomization created a maximum variation up to 9 months of schooling exposure. The first month of testing in the fall, September, and the last month of testing in the spring, that is June. So a full year of schooling exposure, if you will. Then the second important requirement, variation in birth dates. This is actually something that is not there in the sample. Okay? It's true that parents might manipulate a bit children's age at entry. They can decide, their kids are not ready for school, and they can try to, postpone the school entry, or they can try to anticipate the school entry as well. But the key intuition here is that by selecting those kids who complied with the rules of enrollment, among them, birth dates are random. Okay, only among them. And this is what I did. Basically, in each country and in each region within the country and in each school, even in the US, the rules to enroll primary school were different. Usually there's something like this: children must enter school the year they turn 6. Okay, so there is basically a cutoff date. If you are, within the right birth range, then you must enter school on that year. Otherwise, you have to wait for next year. This is the rule. So based on these rules, I selected only the sample of kids with a regular school enrollment that complied with the rule. And the nice thing is that these kids happen to be 90% of the kids in my representative sample in Germany. So the vast majority, 82 to 90% in Denmark, depending on the school year, and 70% in the US. So I would argue that let's think of what happened with an experimental design. You have internal validity, but you have no external validity whatsoever. While in this case, I believe I have some internal validity combined with a very good level of external validity as well, because the results will be representative of 90% of these kids in Germany, for example, and 70% in the US. This is the idea. But let's cut short on the data. I want to show you some results. First of all, the results in Germany regarding SES and migration inequality. I will focus on 3 aspects. How strong is inequality, first. Do children learn because of school? And finally, do schools decrease or increase learning inequality across the groups? Okay, just to structure a bit the results. And here you see in Germany that there are strong SES and migration-related inequalities in the achievements in first grade. What you see here is the SES gradient by parental education measured in years, which ranges from 15 to 20% of a standard deviation per year of parental education. So there is a huge gap. And what you see here is that also migrants do worse than natives generally, but the worst off are basically Turkish kids, because they suffer a penalty not only in grammar and vocabulary like those from the former Soviet Union and Westerners, but also in math and science, in more scientific domains. And this is comparing kids of the same family SES. So this is a pure, if you will, migration-related gap in achievement. Yeah, and the question is, one, do these gaps change by schooling exposure or not? This is something that I will try to answer. But before that, I want to show you the composition of the learning rates in the schooling and aging components. And what you see here is that children learn in school, of course, from 5 to 8% of a standard deviation per month in language, and up to 15% of a standard deviation per month in math and science. But crucially, the schooling component of the learning rate explain only 50% of learning in language, and up to 2/3, 3/4 of the learning in math and science. And this, to me, makes perfect sense, right? Because these are school subjects, while language is more subject to the environments out of the school. So this was, when I first saw this, this was a first validation of my approach, so to say. But now the question is whether, this schooling component changes by children SES and migration background. And this is the results for children SES. This is the interaction between the schooling component and parental SES. And you see that basically there is no evidence for schooling either to increase or decrease social inequality. So it seems like kids benefit from schooling exposure alike, regardless of their social background. And here you see also, yes. These in Germany are, I believe, all schools. So this is a representative sample of kids in first grade. Yeah, I think includes also private schools. I think so. Not sure, but I believe so. Yeah. Then what happens when we look at migration backgrounds? Actually, here I have to guide you with the results a bit, because most of the differences are not statistically significant, but there are two main findings. The first one is that Russians, basically those from the former Soviet Union, learn faster, okay, compared to all others. And they learn faster, actually, because they benefit more from schooling exposure. Okay, they are able to reap the benefit from schooling exposure. You see, for example, in science here, what changes across the different migration groups is not the age effect, but is only the schooling effect, which is higher for them. But on the other hand, you can look at other non-Westerners, as I said, mostly kids with a Turkish background, and they learn basically the least. And they seem to learn the least because they don't get any benefit from schooling exposure. What they learn is because of cognitive maturation over age, it seems. Okay, so if you have to draw a conclusion, what does schooling does, it really depends on the stratification dimension that you are focusing on. But let's move on to the third study about parental separation in Denmark. And here I want to show you the parental separation penalty, the average gap across the 4 grades from 2 to 8. And you see that this is about 6% of a standard deviation in favor of kids from intact families. Okay, so it's a sizable gap. But does this change by schooling exposure? This is something that we will see. Before, I want to show you the composition of the learning rates again across grades. And here, I think what is interesting is that kids learn faster a bit when they're younger, but then a bit less, in grade 8. This is, I think, age 12 or 13, this is age 8 or 9. But the main difference here is that the age effect is only there among young kids. Young kids, they simply learn by aging. This is the idea. While if you look at kids aged basically 13, this is not happening. They only learn because of schooling exposure. And when I saw this, I was like, okay, this kind of makes sense, at least to me. Yeah, and now the question is whether this schooling component of the learning rate changes by parental separation. And you see the results here on the left-hand side. Actually, it seems that, not much is going on except for grade 4. And this positive interaction means that the negative gap actually decreases, okay, by giving additional school exposure. So it seems that schooling is compensating for, parental separation gaps in Denmark, at least 4th grade schooling, not schooling in grade 2 or grade 6 and 8. Okay, and also interesting, you see negative interaction with aging, which makes sense because imagine what happens, if your parents split, then the learning environments at home simply deteriorates, right? So if you spend more time in these environments, the negative effect will become bigger and bigger. This is the idea. Yeah, then quickly, the 4th study about the US. First of all, I'll show you SES inequality, the 2 school grades, the kindergarten year and grade 1. And this is a sizable gap, 30% of a standard deviation, for a standard deviation difference in SES, because I have an index of SES in this case. This is similar across domains. Here you see the learning grades in kindergarten and grade 1, which again are mostly explained by schooling exposure. This is, I think, a very strong regularity that I have, given all these differences in the data, context, and also the methods that I specifically apply to each of these countries. Approximately 2/3, 3/4 of the learning rate is explained by schooling exposure and not aging itself. And then finally, do this schooling effect changes by children SES? It seems, that only exposure to kindergarten is compensating a bit SES gaps. Okay, so the gaps narrow by giving, at random more exposure to kindergarten to children. But this is not the case for grade 1. So compensation is only limited to the kindergarten year. Yeah, nothing is going on by aging. But I think I can now summarize a bit because I think it's not too late, is it? Ah, okay, I can summarize a bit the findings and come towards a conclusion. Basically, in these 4 studies, I found strong gaps depending on the conditions that children experience at home, strong SES gaps, strong gaps by migration background and parental separation. And also there is overwhelming evidence that schooling increased learning. Okay, this is a good news. Exposure to schooling, is making us better. But what is cannot be neglected is that among younger kids, also aging does the job. Without schooling, children would learn to some extent anyway. This is something that I think is quite clear among very young kids. They enter school with some skills that are not developed in school. And this, keeps going over the first year of schooling. They don't stop growing because they are in school. They grow because of aging, but they grow much more because of schooling. This is the idea. And then, as I said, school effects are much stronger than age effects, quite reasonable, and also age effects are not there among older kids. And this is also reasonable as well. But coming to the main question, does schooling increase or decrease inequality? Then the evidence, you might say, is a bit contrasting, but my overall take on this, that the evidence is not really contrasting, because overall, my only answer to this question is that, there is no evidence that schooling is doing, either of the two. Schooling, most of the time, is benefiting kids equally, depending on their family backgrounds. Then results are more nuanced here and there. For example, in the US, the kindergarten year, we found some compensation limited to the kindergarten year. In grade 4 in Denmark, there is also some compensation as well of the gaps by parental separation. And this underlines some compensatory role of schooling in some context. But on the other hand, in Germany, when it comes to migration background, we found that the most disadvantaged kids, that are those from basically whose parents were born in non-Western countries, mostly Turkish, as I said, those kids who are at most disadvantaged also benefit the least from schooling exposure. So schools are not really engines of integration, if you will, in Germany. Yeah, so what do we learn with all this? I'm not sure about what do we learn. I can tell you what I have learned during this process, because this research, span over almost 3 years now. And when I started all this, I had this very naive, if you will, idea of giving a huge, a very precise and conclusive answer to a huge field of research in sociology and sociology of education. That is my field. What is the role of schooling? Are schooling equalizing learning outcomes, or are they disequalizing learning outcomes? And the field was actually divided among those who believe that schooling is a great equalizer and those who believe that schooling is actually doing the opposite. That is a force of disequalization in our society. And I wanted, to step in and give the final answer to this. But then I realized, this is an impossible answer to give. There is no yes and no answer to this. It's not black and white. What I found is that, school effects are mostly not there when it comes to moderating or increasing inequality. But sometimes they are there, but they vary across grades, across cognitive domains, and across countries as well. And I was thinking, why is this the case? What is this suggesting? And then I realized this makes, perfect sense. Why should I expect a consistent finding in each country, for example? Because to me, school effects depends on what schools actually substitute, right? So imagine if kids are not in school, they are at home mostly. So if you have this experimental perspective, if you will, it's easy to understand that even, very unequal schools, imagine that rich kids go to excellent schools and poor kids go to poor schools. Okay? Imagine a system like this, more or less the world that we live in, right? But the point is that with no schooling or with less schooling, the inequality in the learning environments that these kids would experience is even larger. Okay? So it could be the case that even unequal schools are actually equalizing, right? And this is more or less my idea for what is happening in the US, US kindergartens might be extremely unequal, maybe, yeah, but then, they're still less unequal than the home environment. We know that inequality in the US across homes is so stark that even unequal schools may be equalizing. Well, think of what could happen in Denmark or Germany. Denmark and Germany, schools might be more homogeneous, maybe, than the US. So they have a stronger equalizing potential. But on the other hand, we have to think of the out-of-school counterfactual. Inequality in the home environments is not so stark in Germany and Denmark compared to the US, at least. So it could be simply the case, that the amount of inequality in the learning environments that children experience in school and at home is equal. So by giving more school exposure, what you have is that all kids learn less. By giving less school exposure, everyone, learn less, but this doesn't impact inequality because you simply substitute inequality out of the school with inequality in school, and they have, this is the same amount, if you will. So this is, I think, an heuristic that you could use actually to make sense of variation in schooling effects across countries, but also across grades. Always think of the, what happens in absence of schooling. This is crucial to theorize about the role of schooling in our society. But I think I was talking for too long. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Like this. I think it's a It's been a very stimulating and very informative and very clear talk. So now we open the room for questions and comments. Is thing on? Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes, hi. Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting and I learned a lot. So my question is, I suppose, rather simple. So you claim that your design actually relies on this idea of creating random variation in exposure to schooling and in age at the time of testing. So I suppose an implication would be that this variation in schooling exposure and age is unrelated to a number of factors, including school environment. I was wondering if there's a way to actually test school environment. So, you know, how large what's the class size, teacher skills, if there are ways to measure that. I was wondering if you've looked into that and if there's any information you can share with us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Like this one or that one?
Okay, for the next one. I mean, the next question on the next presentation. I forgot. Yeah. The question is, are testing days really random? This was really something that kept me busy for months. And I was reading the fieldwork. And also some of my co-authors, they are German, so they could easily read the fieldwork. And it seems that in Germany, there was a randomization, for example, in 2 windows. So basically, there are seriously randomized schools in 2 windows, February to, I think, March, and then May to June. Then the schools could choose the exact date of testing, only within the window. Okay. Then in the end, I ended up exploiting the overall variation because I checked all correlations within, you know, that were possible. I correlated basically testing dates with characteristics of the schools, the share of migrants, the size of the classrooms, characteristics of the physical environment, children, the average cognitive score within the schools, and so on and so forth. And I couldn't find anything. So this is what gave me confidence. Then in Denmark, I did something similar. There was no randomization, but it seems like, you know, schools basically didn't choose the testing date based on some schools or children characteristics, because we also have to consider these tests are low stakes. So it's not like they give funding to the schools according to the performance, you know. There is no big incentive to cheat in this case. Then in the US, the randomization was perfect because I randomized the kids basically in the 2 periods. Yeah, but this is a crucial aspect of design. Because if this is not random, then you have selection bias. But in principle, also important to say is that you can think of randomizing testing days. You know, so this has implication for, you know, common practice in testing. You could say, for example, in PISA, you know, these PISA scores that, you know, you could say, why don't we randomize the schools in different periods? Because this will give a chance to apply this design as well. You can think of achieve perfect randomization by design when designing, you know, a cognitive, a survey for measuring cognitive skills. But yeah, it's a crucial aspect. I hope I answered. Then we can.
And thank you, Giampiero, for this presentation. This is very interesting research. I have my first question is related to Alina's question, just a clarification on the information you had on the schools. Did you have information on the pedagogical project of the school? I mean, the way the schools teach and the way the schools organize the class. there is this important debate in Catalonia and Spain now on the margin of maneuver that public schools have on the pedagogical project, and within public schools there are now there is a certain heterogeneity of the way they organize the courses and so on, at least in primary school.
Here is a bit heterogeneous because I have 3 countries. 3 countries and 3 data sets as well. I think I don't have, or maybe there are information on the curriculum of the schools, offered by the schools. But on the other hand, I was like, this is part of the thing that I want to study. I mean, it could be that some schools have a different curriculum and ICS kids go to these schools, right? But then I want to study exactly this, whether, you know, notwithstanding this inequality, the out-of-school inequality is even larger. You know, I agree that schools may be extremely unequal. The question is that even if they are unequal, they may be equalizing as well. You know, yeah, an unequal school is better than no school. This is a lesson from COVID, at least.
And just a second question, a quick question on the tests. I was wondering, maybe it's not important, but I was wondering about other skills that are not classic skills. For example, the effects of schooling on creativity, or the effects of schooling on imagination, or things like that. Does the school have an effect, or even a negative effect on these skills?
Yeah, these are good question for. Yeah, I don't have this test in these data sets because usually these data come from, you know, births, basically course studies. So they follow kids over schooling, and in each year they test kids on different domains. This was the case for the NAPS in Germany, for example. So kids are tested in vocabulary science. The year after they're tested, I don't know, in something else, pure IQ or whatever. So I don't have, you know, all tests I wanted to have in each grade. And I think there are no something like, I think there are not even tests for this non-traditional academic skills. What is there are tests for non-cognitive skills. So for example, you know, social skills, if you will. This is something for which there is data, and actually you could run the design to study school effects on behavioral problems, for example, or non-cognitive skills as well. This is something that I haven't done, but this is something that we could do.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was very educational for all of us. Sorry, I didn't mean to make that pun, but very interesting. I had 2 questions. One was a small sort of a selection question about the Danish data set about divorced parents, right? Or separated parents. Do you have any information about the age of the child at time of separation of their parents? And then also the time difference between that separation and the test? Because I would imagine, you know, it's if your parents got separated when you were in 2nd grade and you got tested 3 months later, there might be a different effect than the 8th grader whose parents separated in 2nd grade, or that variation. That's one question. And then I have a different one, but.
Yeah, no, these are very, okay, sit. No, these are very good points. Now I presented only the results for the dummy version, so separated or not, but I actually experimented a lot also with the dosage approach. So let's see the length of time spent in, you know, with parents who are split. And this is something we did, something that is actually, this is actually the main thing that is in the paper, but you know, for presentation purposes, it was kind of easier to stick with the dummy approach. And what we found is that, of course, the longer is the time spent in a separated family, if you will, and the lower is your score. So
okay, so it doesn't balance out.
No, the gap increases with the time spent, you know, in a with parents who are split. But this, of course, is perfectly correlated with the age at which you experience,
Yeah.
this is, the younger you are, the more time you spend in that environment before the testing. So you cannot disentangle whether this is the time spent or the age. But again, these are reality. The only way to spend more time in this environment is because the event happened before. There is no other way around it.
That makes sense. And then the second question, which you can choose not to answer, is normative, is equalizing a goal for schooling, or is it an appropriate goal for schooling? But that's a different, so I'm going to pass the mic.
Yeah, this is a good question. The point is to feed this normative debate, which is important in society, we need to have evidence, right? So as of now, we have people arguing it should be, schools should be equalizing, while now they are disequalizing. Yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure. No. My role is to provide evidence to feed this debate, I think.
I think that there are 5 questions first, then Alba, Maria Jose, Pau, Martin, and then.
The microphone doesn't work very well, so when you answer the question, when you make the question, please put it close to your mouth.
Thank you, Piero, for your presentation. I have missed the first part of the presentation, so maybe my questions are dumb. But can you please first tell me why randomization of the exam date should the question is related to Alina's and Mark's comment. Why the randomization of the exam per se should take out all these characteristics at school level, for example, at classroom level, differences, right? Why it should, so that's a clarifying question, because for example, my colleagues from KU Leuven studying only civic education knowledge at schools, at school levels, they found that there's big effect even at the teacher level. So the classroom level makes difference with the schools that they get, knowledge schools. So, and they usually cluster across, or school level or class level, even, teacher effect, etc. So I don't know if you clustered for it and why the randomization should, that's the first question. Second question is more my curiosity. Why do you think the Turkish were the least disadvantaged from education? What are your thoughts about it? Thank you.
Yeah, regarding the first, randomization is crucial because it's like randomizing a treatment. Okay, like imagine giving a pill, a drug or not. So you randomize the treatment, and then if the randomization is perfect, yeah, this is because yeah, I know. Yeah, I know, but I'll try to summarize. How can I? Yeah, imagine, if you can follow kids over time and you measure learning, okay, each time. So you can measure the learning rate, right? Imagine you don't have this longitudinal data, okay? So you can only test kids once. In that case, you can randomize the testing. And in that case, you can recover the population average learning rate. You don't have the individual level because each kid is tested once, but at the population level, you can, compute the average amount of learning per unit of time by randomizing the testing dates. And the idea behind the approach is that, if you combine this variation in testing dates with variation in birth dates, you can even disentangle the learning rates in the effect of schooling, the schooling component of the learning rate, and the aging component, that is simply that children are getting smarter because they are older. This was the idea. That's why random variation in testing dates was crucial, but also random variation in birth dates was crucial as well. And then the second point was about why I think Turkish kids benefit the least from schooling. You can think of a variety of mechanisms. The first one could be discrimination, of course, because they're treated differently in school or by their peers or by the teachers, or maybe because they attend poor schools as well, maybe they cluster in poor schools, right? This is another thing. Yeah, I mean,
So
yeah,
it's important to, you know,
I have to say this research is pretty silent about the mechanisms. I know but then the other thing is that, which is a bit puzzling, is that it's not just about vocabulary, because that would be understandable, you know. They have the same SES, but maybe their parents don't speak German. So they have lower aging effect, but then on the other hand, they should learn faster in school, isn't it? Because you don't have German, but then you end up being in a German school where you speak German, so you should learn faster, actually. So this is puzzling to me. But then you have the same for science, a completely different domain. So I was not able to, you know, disentangle the mechanisms by only reasoning around these things. And then there is also, of course, selection. You know, the migrants that come in a country, they are different. We don't know according to which characteristics they are selected. You know, I have no idea. There is no way to know.
Thank you, Giampiero, for the presentation. I think it creates many questions, which is something positive. And one of the questions that I have is related to something that Mark said, that basically we want to know why some countries are more efficient to create equality. And this is a question that I particularly have at the comparative level. Why are countries more efficient to, for instance, to keep children in a school, in education? And for the particular case of Spain, we know that we have the highest dropout rate among teenagers not finishing secondary education, and particularly boys. So what are the school components that are driving these results? This is not particularly your research, but I was wondering whether you have any explanation for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think here, of course, these results are limited to the first years of schooling, and they are limited to cognitive achievements. So I don't study school dropouts and other very relevant outcomes over the educational career. But my overall take on this is that, you know, much of the research, at least in my field, you know, came from this perspective that schools are bad, that schools create inequalities, you know, that we should address this. And I totally agree. You know, the school system can be better. We can, you know, strengthen, you know, lower the amount of learning, the inequality in the learning environment that they offer to kids. But overall, the point is, you know, schools are still equalizing, maybe. No, maybe not. Even bad schools are better than no school. That this is where I was coming from. So in this perspective, my results, I think, show that, you know, schools are not really equalizing. They're not doing much in terms of learning inequality. They're improving learning, but they are not overall equalizing, and they're not disequalizing either. So I think we should have a more balanced perspective on, you know, what schools do in our societies. But then this is limited, of course, to the early years. You can say, okay, those schools play a role later on. And my guess is that if they don't play a role early on, why should they play a role later on? You know what I mean? Like, you know, if you focus on first grade, is the first instance of schooling. So if you find some equalization, it should be there. Why should appear, you know, later for explaining dropouts, for example?
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. I learned a lot. And my question is about, a dog that it came from the beginning. Are you assuming that there is a linear relationship between learning and the time of schooling and the age? So like for every one day more that we are in a school, we we learn the same amount of knowledge, and if it's not a linear relationship, how you dealt in your model with this?
Yeah, totally. Of course, I'm assuming that. Yeah, yes. I'm assuming the learning is linear while it could be non-linear. But my point is that I think I had not so much leverage to study, to study non-linearities because of the variation in schooling exposure. So in Germany, I have 5.5 months. In Denmark, I have 3 months, like a summer gap. Maybe in the US, I could do that, but then, the point is testing days are not normally distributed. As I said, in Germany, there were 2 testing windows. So this creates like a dichotomy, it's either 1 month of schooling exposure or 5 months. So how can you, it was already, I think, maybe too much, to have this linear relationship given this distinction. So examining non-linearities was not, I think, really feasible in this case. To do that, you should have a perfect randomization over the school year. There's some kids in September, October, November, December, blah, blah, blah. But it is something that you can do if you design a survey, a testing in this way.
If I understood well, you are exploiting the.
The microphone doesn't seem to be working very well, or maybe it has been off. Hopefully,
It's working. It's not working?
it is, but you have to put it very close to the mouth.
More. Is you hear me? No, okay. Okay, very interesting. And if I understood well, you are exploiting the starting age of primary school. But what about if children actually started the school much earlier? By starting a school, I mean kindergarten. And this is a school environment. And probably this might explain part of your effect of families in language. I don't know.
Yeah. No, this is very important. I tried in each country to focus on the first instance of exposure to schooling. Okay, so for example, in Germany, this is grade 1 in the sense that kindergarten, strictly speaking, is part of the welfare system in Germany. It's under the Ministry of Welfare. It's not education. So I had this institutional perspective of studying. But then I agree that, it might be that kindergarten might be equalizing as well. But then I was thinking country by country, okay, in Germany, kindergarten, to my knowledge at least, is more playful. It's not like you receive instruction in classrooms. While in the US, it's more like that. That's why I included kindergarten, within schooling exposure, if you will, because in the US, I also studied kindergarten effects. But then it's very interesting to see that in the US, kindergarten is equalizing while grade 1 is not. This suggests that equalization might happen very early. In the US, I found some equalization in kindergarten, but not in grade 1.
So you actually included kindergarten in the US data?
Only in the US, yeah.
Because there might be high inequality in that respect.
Yeah.
In the type of kindergarten and in the exposure to.
Yeah, 2 reasons. First of all, because kindergarten is more schooling in the US than in Germany or Denmark. And also because, also the entry into kindergarten is governed by this enrollment rule. So it's based on children's age relative to a cutoff age. While in Germany, it's not the case. You send kids to kindergarten, basically whatever you want to, in the middle of the year, anytime. So this was also the problem. But then I have to say again, in Germany, kindergarten is almost universal. So as a matter of fact, 90% of the kids attend kindergarten. Okay. Yeah. So I think it's not the case that, kindergarten confounded the findings because basically all kids went to kindergarten. I don't know how long, this might differ by parents SES, for example. But these are my thoughts. And then I had no data on kindergarten in Germany, I think, for this sample at least.
I have one question about the divorce effects, because if I understood the developmental psychology right, it's a curvilinear function. That is, the divorce effect is much less when the children are very, very, very young. And then it peaks when they are in mid-childhood and declines when they are in older childhood. In other words, you might want to test with a quadratic function. The other thing is getting back to my family effects. The family effects would also influence the age at which children go into school because of the preparedness of school by school age. For example, we know that highly educated parents spend twice as much time with active learning activities with their children as do less educated parents. In other words, the children are much more school prepared at a much earlier age. And there you have a parental SES effect coming in, dictating the way your kids start the schooling trajectory that you're examining.
Thank you. Regarding the divorce effect, first of all, I was not specific about this. This is not just divorce, it's a parental separation. So yeah, but I understand your arguments, but this is my answer. This is what I see in the data. Like divorce effect seems to be quite similar across grades from 2 to 8, which is from, help me, from age 8 to 13. It could be that later on are different, of course. Yeah, it could be that they increase. Yeah. Could be. But also I think, my main concern with this is that, of course, this parental separation effect is not a causal effect. This could be purely selection, who separate or not. There is another question that we address in the paper. We try to understand whether it is a causal effect or not. But the point is, whether it is a causal effect or just an association, is interesting to see the role of schooling. Is schooling increasing these gaps or decreasing the gaps? But unfortunately, I think with this design, you cannot study school exposure effect, when kids are too old, because you have up to 9 months variation in schooling exposure, which can make a huge difference among kids age 10 or 9 or 7, but maybe not among 15 years old. Imagine, why should 2 months exposure to schooling make a difference? Because then it's a low share of your age, So this is the main limitation, of this approach. It's better to study younger kids rather than older kids. And about your second point was about the age at entry that can be manipulated by parents. Yeah, this is of course possible. If you think that your kid is not ready for school, you can try to postpone the entry to the next year, right? But this, of course, we should make a separate, let's say, analysis for each country because things are very different across countries. For example, in Germany, what you can do, basically, if your child are close to the cutoff only, imagine you are 6 or 5.9, and the cutoff is being 6 in that year. In that case, you can manipulate and say, hey, I want to send my kid to school earlier or later. But then what you have to do, you have to file an application, you have to apply for anticipation or postponement, and then they decide. So parents can apply, but then someone else, the school, decide. Okay.
And you can postpone very, very easily. So
Very easily. I'm trying to, oh, yeah, sometimes it blocks. But then what I see, at least in my sample, which in the case of Denmark is not a sample, is a population data. Yeah, registered data. 80–90% of these kids had a regular school enrollment. So they enter school exactly the year they should have, according to the rule. So depending on the year, you might have 20% of kids were outside the right school range, but these are dropped from my sample. I only focus on those who comply with the rule because only among them birthdays were random. You know, this is a matter of trading external validity by selection to preserve internal validity. That was my approach. You know, but I think, you know, the benchmark is experiments, high internal validity, no external validity whatsoever. In this case, only for kids, kids, it's not just about kids, only for people included in the experiment, of course, you have in external validity. But then I have representative data at the population level, in some cases even population data, and I have 82% of these kids who comply with the rule. And so the results are externally valid for basically the compliers who are, in the case of Denmark, 82 to 90% of this cohort of kids. So I would say it's pretty okay, at least.
Yeah.
No, I will save mine for later. We had a question from home like a while ago. Of course, we prioritize people in the room always, but it'd be nice to allow her.
Let's
give room to these questions.
And we're running out of time, so.
Okay, it was actually mine was related to the last point Josta raised, and again is the issue of whether actually entrance getting early into school is really random, and because if it is, there is a chance that it is not, and you know it might be that it's a selected sample. You know, I don't know, they are smarter or more prepared, or it's from better families, and that's actually so. But you gave the explanation, and I suppose that for most of them, you can treat it as a random event, whether they get early into school or earlier or later, having the same age. And that's my question, because if it is not random, then to assume that it's really a schooling effect, I'm not sure.
Thanks for the presentation. I mean, the method is really fascinating. And I agree also that some of unobservable characteristics that may affect testing are also averaged out to the treatment. But due to respect to the German case that you were mentioning, the 2 windows, I was thinking, for example, to the mounting literature on climate change or temperature effects on testing results. If that is the case, then, for example, different temperatures in the 2 windows may affect then the treatment, the random approach that you introduced.
Yeah, but then what I did, I also exploited only variation within 1 window. So from January to March, of course, it could make a difference. But my take on this literature on the effect of temperatures is that what matters are extreme events, like, you know, hot waves, for example. This is what matters, not a difference in 2 or 3 grades. So if you exploit variation between January and March in Germany, then you are more or less fine, but this is a possibility, of course. And then going to Jorge's question, I mean, I was trying to do 2 things. First of all, reasoning about the rules of enrollment, you know, the legislation, how things should be, and then what is happening in reality. But of course, I was not fine with it. Then, you know, on the empirical side, I tried to understand whether there was some predictors of, birth dates among the compliers, and I couldn't find any. I correlated not only testing dates, but also birth dates with many characteristics of the children, their achievement prior, even characteristics of the schools, characteristics of the parents, the father and the mother. And I couldn't find any a correlation. But the nice thing is that you find these correlations if you focus on the non-compliers. So if you focus on the overall sample, there is a correlation. So I can show you maybe something. So what I did additionally was to only select, those kids in the middle of the birth range. Okay, because in practice, the only kids who can apply for anticipation or postponement are those who made the cutoff by little. So I excluded them. I concentrated only on those in the middle, that are those who really they could apply, but they would not success. This, at least in Germany, this is what I did to experiment a bit. And what I found is that, the overall sample, there is some correlation with SES and age at entry. Among the compliers, it's not statistically significant. Then if you consider this sample B by restricting even, then it goes to 0. And then it goes, sample B and C. So this was my way to, understanding what is going on. So I agree that parents try to manipulate the age at entry. Whether they succeed depends on the country, but empirically we can select those who can't, manipulate. This was the strategy.
Is there a rule for SARSAT? So, sorry, SARSAT, if you are.
No worries. Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. I also posted my question. Thank you so much, Piero, for your very interesting talk and for deep appreciation for taking up the task of establishing causality when it's extremely challenging. After all, as you said, how would you sign students to not go to school or to go to school? I was wondering about the mechanism. I was also wondering about the mechanism in explaining some of the nuances of the results. And of course, having my social psychological lens on, and aside from the quality of schooling, I was wondering if children's social integration in school and perhaps lack of school system sensitivity to students' diversity in terms of immigration status, having a nuclear family, etc., could create some of these gaps in learning. So could it be that students with less traditional backgrounds face social isolations that affect their learning and school achievement? So it's not about the content, but it's about other social psychological pressures that they face as they enter a school system. Of course, I know it's a big question, but I would just love to hear your thoughts on some of the mechanisms. As you said, the field is a bit quiet on the mechanism. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Shahzad. Yeah, I think the mechanism that you mentioned might be there. The point is whether this is the only mechanism, right? Because it could be that this mechanism is working towards schooling, increasing the gaps, but there may be many mechanisms working in the other direction. So overall, you could find no effect of schooling as well. So when you study mechanisms, it's very difficult. Usually we found an outcome, a result, and then we speculate about one mechanism only affecting the outcome, but there could be many that cancel out, right? So I agree that what the one you mentioned is a very good explanation for why schooling might be actually increasing the gaps. Whether this is the only mechanism in place, it's a question that I cannot really answer now. Probably there are many.
So I've been dying to ask you if you have tried or will try any multi-level modeling, because if you could had school data, for instance, just the percentage of children in each class or even at the school level that are Turkish or non-migrant versus non-migrant. I mean, some schools, I mean, you would see, going back to the social psychological point Shad made, you would think that even if the teachers belong to the majority culture, if the school is predominantly Turkish or migrant school, migrant population, they would have to address this climate issue. So I think it seems to me like the school data is really important here for level analysis, isn't it?
Yeah, this was one idea to see whether school effects were different depending on the characteristics of the school. This is something that I will do at some point. The point is that I cannot isolate the school effect school by school, given the data, because the variation is a variation between the schools. So all kids in the same school were tested on the same day. So I have no variation there. So I have to group schools. So I have to say groups with higher shares of migrants versus others. This is something that I wanted to do, but something that I will do at some point. But what I want to stress is that if we had variation in testing dates within the schools, we could even test, the effect of each school. This could be a device for, judging upon whether schools, one by one, are increasing or decreasing inequality. This is something that will never be allowed, I think, by school principals, right? Because, yeah, I know, but they know, at least in Italy, where I'm coming from, they are even resisting cognitive testing. They don't want, people to test, the learning of their kids. But the point is that they are afraid that, you don't score high, right? So you are penalized. But actually, the point is not whether you score high or low, it's whether you improved against the counterfactual no school situation. So it could be that even, schools that score very low are doing an amazing job at increasing learning. And this is something you could do if you had this variation, but they would never agree. They would never trust me.
I think, no, you close it. The host closes the session.
Sorry. So thank you very much for your talk. I think it's been really stimulating, and I hope the comments, I think there's been a really lively debate. So thank you for coming, and we're looking forward to the next forum.
Thank you.